Hello and welcome back to Speed Bumps with Charlie Kimball. I, of course, am your host, Charlie Kimball, and I am thrilled to have a guest whose story is truly one of a kind. From the high-speed world of Formula One aerodynamics to creating what many consider the best croissants. Yes, you heard that right, croissants in the world. Kate Reid's journey is anything but ordinary. As the founder of Lune croissants in Australia, Kate didn't just bring her engineering background into the kitchen. She reinvented the croissant making process with the precision and innovation you'd expect from a Formula One aerodynamicist. But her path wasn't without speed bumps. Today, we'll talk about how she turned a bold career shift into a global pastry sensation. Say that 3 times fast. The struggles she faced along the way and the mindset that's fueled her success, even now as a doctor. So whether you're a foodie, a fan of inspiring career transformations, or just love a really good comeback story, you're going to want to stick around for this one. So from laminar flow to lamination, let's welcome Dr. Kate Reid. Kate, thanks for joining us.
Oh my God, laminar flow to lamination. No one's ever said that. I'm going to quote that. So good. Thanks, Charlie.
I have to say, I was very proud of myself for thinking of that because laminar flow and like separation and stalling is about the limit of my aerodynamic terminology. So,
but that's pretty important for what you do, right?
Well, yeah. Either as a race car driver or now as a private pilot, like aerodynamic stalls are something that my instructors drilled into me. That's something you want to avoid, apparently, because it leads to falling out of the sky. So, I do want to start, Kate,
unless maybe you're an acrobatic pilot.
Right. And that's a whole different thing. And that's way too scary for me. But I want to start actually with where we first met. I was racing in England and you were working at Williams in Formula One. And we got to meet my sister, Rachel. We all became friends and kind of cycled and circled around the same friends groups. But when did your love for Formula One start? Where did this want to be an engineer and an aerodynamicist really begin with?
Look, I think we probably have a lot of parallels in our childhoods, in particular with our dads. I know that your dad was such a big player in Formula One, such an important mainstay. My dad had loved Formula One for my entire childhood. He used to race Formula Vs, which I'm not sure if that's a class that they race around the world, but it's certainly a class in Australia. And by the time I came along, he was told that he wasn't allowed to race anymore because, he had to be a responsible dad and had to be around to help raise his daughter, but had never lost the love of motorsport. So I think I was a really big daddy's girl. And from a young age, I just wanted to hang around him. And that meant things like, on weekends, jumping in the ute and going to the tip or the hardware store or going to look at classic cars. But mainly it meant watching Formula One with my dad. And he never pushed me into doing it. But I think at some point I was like, this is really exciting. And, I'd never been to a Formula One race in person, but it was this amazing circus that was happening around the world, high technology, high drama, very dangerous in these glamorous locations like Monaco and Germany, the UK, the US, Australia. It was global. And I think it must have been 1996, which was the first year that the Australian Grand Prix was moved from Adelaide to Melbourne. And Dad was like, hey, kids, I'm going to take you 2 out of school on the Friday because I can't afford to buy a race day ticket, but I really want you to experience Formula One in person. So we'll go along to free practice. And that was when they had the V10 engine still as well, that piercing squeal that just cut through the air. And I mean, you could hear it from our house, which was about 11 or 12 kilometers away from the circuit on a really clear day. But I remember getting closer and closer to the circuit, and I think they must have already been out doing their first free practice on the Friday, and Dad gave us earplugs. And there was something so thrilling about being in an environment where the sound was so dangerous that you had to wear earplugs to protect your ears. But then I remember we entered the circuit. We just had general admission passes. And there was this area that used to be called Brocky's Hill, but it's the big sweeping left-hander coming around the lake. And we kind of came across the hill and this F1 car just flashed past me. And, I was 12, 13 years old, and it was going so fast that like I couldn't even make out what it was. But I just remember the sound ripping through me as well. And then there was another one and another one, and like the smell, the sound, the energy, just even like everyone had stopped to witness this real, like this feat of technology and science. And I just caught the bug at that moment. And from that moment on, everything about my life, like every waking thought that I had, every action that I could take was something that had to get me closer to Formula One. I was totally obsessed.
I have this silly grin plastered on my face, and I am covered in goosebumps because you describing that moment is exactly the same as the first time I saw a Formula One car come through the old Maggots Beckett's complex at Silverstone in the wet. And these cars came through, and it was just like, I was racing cars at that time, and I thought there was no way within the laws of physics they should be able to do that. And you talk about that piercing whine, that the V10 that just seared your soul, right? It reached into your like original core being and touched you.
Yep.
And for me, like hearing you say that, like that, I'm like, yep, I got it.
Yeah.
I've been there. We've all been there, right? Everyone who has fallen in love with racing head over heels at times has felt that moment.
And it's normally
So every waking moment's thinking about Formula One. Where do you go from there? How do you go from, being on Brocky's Hill at 10, 11, 12 years old, and then end up designing parts in a wind tunnel in CFD that end up on a Williams Formula One car?
Well, you're going to find this hilarious, but my first instinct was, I've got to be a driver, because that's the most natural, like they're the ones that you see out in the cars. And I think as a 12 or 13-year-old, you don't fully understand the myriad of people and different skills and experience that go into making that happen. You see the driver in the car. So I said to Dad that I wanted to race go-karts, and he's like, well, you better go get yourself a part-time job. You have to pay for it if you want it. So I went out and I got myself a part-time job, and I bought myself a go-kart, and I signed up to a circuit as a member, and I would pester Dad like a few times a week. It was a 1-hour drive away. And I'm like, Dad, can we go to the go-kart track? And Charlie, I was obsessed with just getting the fastest lap time. And I'd want to go to the circuit when no one else was there, and I would focus on like fractional improvements on corners or braking or acceleration. And at some point, Dad was like, are you going to race this thing, or are you just going to keep driving it around to see how fast you can go? And I think this speaks to my personality. I'm like, yeah, okay, I'll go in a race. And so we signed up for my first race. And just before my heat was going out, the heat before, there was this straight at the circuit that I was a member of. And it was a downhill straight with a hairpin turn at the end and almost no runoff area, and then a fly wire fence. And some kid's brakes failed at the end of the straight, and he went nose first into the tiny bit of gravel, flipped him out of the go-kart, and he ended up hanging from the fly wire fence. And I'm standing at the front of the track like 14 years old, terrified. And Dad's like, get in the bloody go-kart and go and race. Anyway, needless to say, I didn't set the world on fire or the track on fire. So I think pretty soon after that moment, I was always gifted in the maths and sciences at school, and not just gifted, but I loved them too. I was probably a bit of a nerd at school, probably still a bit of a nerd. But so I just decided that, like, by this stage, I was getting way more into Formula One and understanding that there were whole teams. Like, I was actually really obsessed with the idea of the strategist's role. I thought it was such an exciting role that was so crucial to the success of the race, like understanding all of the different elements and variables that go into making a win happen. So I started to research the technical side. I went along to a university open day. It was actually for automotive engineering, but I spoke, and I do think the universe works like this. I spoke to a particular lecturer who said, look, automotive's okay, but if you want to work in Formula One, I'd be studying aerospace engineering because it covers everything that automotive does, but a Formula One car is more akin to an aeroplane than it is really a car, and give yourself the advantage of studying particularly aerodynamics and propulsion and things like that. So, yeah, I think from about the age of 14, my goal was aerospace engineering at uni, which I got into straight away after high school at RMIT in Melbourne. That was a 5-year degree, and I loved every single second of that degree. I think, like at high school, you've got to do stuff like French and English and PE and all these things that weren't related to Formula One for me, but suddenly everything I was studying was relevant and it was going to help me get there. And I just soaked up the knowledge like a sponge. So yeah, that's the journey for studying aero. I then, you'd know Cranfield University in the UK. One of my lecturers told me that they had a motorsport engineering and management master's. This was the year after I finished uni. He's like, I'd really recommend that you try and apply for that because they only let in 10 or 12 people a year. It's partially funded by the F1 team, so it's kind of like a golden ticket into Formula One. So I applied for that, and that application process was so full on, but I ended up being offered a spot. And I think at that point I knew that no matter what, I was going to get into Formula One. But because I'm dogged about this stuff, I just started writing off to all the Formula One teams saying, hey, I'm going to Cranfield next year. I'd really love to come and do some work experience. And I got back a whole lot of donuts, silence or rejection letters. But one team, and my dream team, Williams, sent me an email. I woke up really early one morning in December 2005, and they said, look, we're not looking for work experience students, but we are looking for junior aerodynamicists. We'd really love to interview you for the role. And I got it.
So you went from asking for an internship to getting an interview for a real job and the opportunity to go and work for your dream team and work for Frank and then Claire and be a part of that Williams name that is one of the cornerstones in Formula One. And so you're there, right? You're in Formula One, and is this when you hit maybe your first speed bump? Other than at the go-kart track watching the race before you spit a kid into the fence, is this the first speed bump where you think, okay, maybe this isn't exactly what I wanted, or do you get there and life is gravy, and is it perfect at that moment? What happens when you get there?
So I reckon the first 6 to 8 months of moving to the UK and working for Williams, I kind of had rose tinted glasses on, and I was living my dream life, right? It's this thing that I'd been planning for a decade by now. Every ounce of my being had been focused on achieving this. I was working for my dream team. I had these great new friends, and you and Rachel were a big part of that. We had a really cool group of people that we would hang out with. And, we would do things remember when we went to see the Rolling Stones in London, and there was the World Cup that summer. I think it was being hosted in Germany, and the whole of England just became football obsessed. And at the same time, I was working as an aerodynamicist in Formula One, but there was so many new factors that maybe I didn't have time to really sit and focus and think, hang on, is this my dream job now that I'm here? But I think at some point, maybe around the June, July mark of that year, I'd been working at Williams for 6 months or so by then, and I certainly wasn't loving work. I mean, I was still loving Formula One, and I was happy that I was working in Formula One, but the actual day-to-day task of sitting at my desk and what I had to do, it wasn't exactly as I'd envisioned my life when I'd be working in Formula One. And I think at the start, when I'd first identified that, I was like, surely you're really new to this. You're a rookie. You've got to earn your stripes. It'll get more interesting. It will get better. But then at some point I was looking around the office, and guys who had been, 2, 3, 4 years ahead of me, they were doing the same things that I was doing. And I was like, maybe this isn't just a I'm new thing. Maybe this is a what it is to be an aerodynamicist working in Formula One thing. And I think at that point I had a bit of a panic moment, is it going to get better, or is this it? And I really want to preface now that it's like the environment that I worked in would suit some people. Like some people would be suited to the culture of the office and that, like, you know me, I'm a huge chatterbox. I'm a big personality. I like to be around energetic, positive people that feel excited about life. And it didn't help that Williams wasn't having a great season. But I worked with a lot of quiet, head down, introverted people that didn't want to collaborate or brainstorm or work as a team. And I thought that's what F1 was.
So you're saying you worked in a room full of engineers and they were maybe a little less extroverted than you were in the engineering office. And okay, so like my first thought listening to you talk about this, about the work it was when you were there in 2005, 2006 era, was not what you envisioned maybe building with an aerospace degree. Do you think had it been, and this is way off topic and a little out of left field, do you think had it been in the era of massive innovation of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, where you would have been able to rewrite the textbooks as you were going through a single season? Do you, rather than looking for tiny little pieces, do you think it would have felt different in that moment, in a different era?
Charlie, no one has ever asked me that question. And it's such a cracker. Means I haven't thought about it, but now you're asking me, like, it reminds me a bit of the early space race and JFK saying in like 1960, in 10 years' time, we're going to land on the moon, and just being in this period of time where every idea is an idea worth exploring and everything is exciting and it's people doing things for the first time and like rewriting the rule book. And I think, yeah, you know what?
Right.
Yeah, maybe. It's also, I think one of the things, and like ultimately Formula One is competition flat out. It's not like, for example, an engineering company trying to design something because their goal is to design something. Like everything about Formula One is competition. And unfortunately for me, I really felt like the competition even came into the office and we were sort of pegged against our teammates, which this is a recent reflection of mine, but like you should look to the person next to you and feel like you're on the same team working towards the same goal, not like I've got to prove myself in comparison to them. And they didn't do a very good job of shifting the culture on that. I actually think they lent into that culture. So there was a bit of a culture of fear that if you weren't working harder than the person next to you, you might lose your job. Because I remember one of the engineers telling me that something like 3,000 CVs landed on the desk of the HR department every week. So, you know, if you're not in the office at 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock every night, then, hey, we'll replace you really quickly. And so you kind of have this thing where you'd be sitting at your desk at 9 o'clock and you'd look up around the like open plan office and you're like, he's gone home. How many more people do I have to wait to go home before it's okay for me to go home? And like, what a terrible culture. Like, I don't even know if I was being productive at 10 o'clock at night. I was just sitting there like thinking I've got to look like I'm being productive. But, you know, after 12 hours at your desk, no one's productive.
And so I can imagine it lends itself to being fairly unhealthy, right? It's like putting hours in like that and not necessarily being productive, not being fulfilled. You know, it's probably a pretty unhealthy lifestyle. And at what point did those rose-colored glasses come off? Like you said you started, you were like, okay, first 6 months, it's going to change. And then you get further into it and maybe it's not changing, but you spent your whole existence from seeing that first ever Formula One car to get to this point. It like you're a little, the vision I have is a little of the dog that chases the car and catches the car and realizes that maybe that's not what he wanted. Is that fair?
Yeah, maybe it's not great to catch the car.
Right.
In hindsight, I think if I'd been maybe a bit older and more mature and wiser, I would have realized that if it wasn't going to work out at my dream team, it probably wasn't going to work out. But I'd started to identify the fact that I wasn't being fulfilled professionally, and I wasn't getting what I needed at work. And so I actually changed teams. And as I said, if Williams wasn't going to work for me, no team was probably going to work for me. But like as you said, I dedicated my entire life to getting there. So I threw everything at it. I wasn't willing to give up. But changing teams was probably an even worse idea, because the team I went to, somehow the culture was even worse. And at that point, I definitely had developed depression, but it went undiagnosed, probably because at that point in time, I didn't really know what depression was. And, you didn't talk about it. You certainly didn't talk about it in the office with all your male colleagues, like, oh, I'm feeling a bit down today. You just get on with it because everyone's getting on with it. So, yeah, I developed depression, but then the depression manifested itself into something even more even more awful. And it's another form of a mental illness, which was an eating disorder, anorexia. And it's interesting, like, so many people think anorexia is about body image and food, but for a lot of people that suffer from it, it's actually more of a control thing. And at the point in time that I started to go down that path, there were many big aspects of my life that were out of control. Like, I really wasn't in my dream job. I was missing my beautiful family that were half a world away. I didn't have a good support network around me at the time. Like, in moving from Williams, I'd almost left behind this like very precarious little support network that I'd started to build myself. And I think when you get depressed, you isolate yourself a bit as well. So I didn't really let people support me. So I had so many things out of control, and I became very, very sick. So much to the point where I think one of the reasons that I was sticking it out in the UK was I was so worried about letting my dad down. Like, motor racing had been this thing that had made us bond when I was little. And then it was this thing that we had in common that was so special and unique. And I was so proud that I'd gotten a job in this thing that Dad and I loved together. And I think I was worried at admitting that it wasn't working out, that I would be failing and letting him down. So when I had a conversation with Dad when I was really ill one night, and he said, maybe you should think about coming home, it wasn't really a question. It was him giving me permission. Like, it was him saying, it's okay to come home.
And knowing you as I do, and you knowing our family, and having the conversations about your family and the stories over the years, I would imagine that for you, it felt like permission from him to come home. And for him, it was never about that. It was only about the best for you as his daughter.
You've nailed it. And I feel like it might be a poignant moment to answer it. You did send me, you said there are 3 questions that you ask everyone. And I don't know if you ask them in succession at the end, do you?
I do, but I am happy to ask, I presume it's the what's the best advice you've ever gotten and from whom question you'd like me to ask now. So a little out of order because go for it. What is the best advice you've ever gotten and from whom, Kate?
So the day I was leaving Australia to move my entire life to the UK to work in Formula One, I had a little wobble. I was sitting in my room by myself, and I'm suddenly realizing that I'm leaving behind this family that I love, this country that I love living, this great life that I've had, and I'm going into the unknown. And I was sitting on the floor feeling incredibly nervous about getting on the plane. And Dad said to me, nothing has to be forever. And that's like, it's actually making me feel emotional. That is the best advice you can give anyone. Like, you can give something a go. You're not committing to it forever. And also, even if you think you've committed to something forever, if you decide that it's not right for you at some point, if you live it and you're like, hang on, this isn't giving me what I need in life, you don't have to keep doing it. It's fine. And like, Dad had actually given me permission before I even left. I didn't realize how big and important those words were at the time.
Yeah, and I think we should take a second to
Yep.
reflect on how incredible that was, that you were chasing this dream, and even in that moment, like as any individual, and I won't say young person, because even as I get older, I notice there are moments where I'm like, yeah, this is absolutely the right call, and then I'm getting ready to do it and go, wait a minute, I'm not sure it's the right call anymore, and so those moments of doubt creep in, and for your dad to see that and say, "Give it a shot." Like, essentially, "Give it a
Right.
shot, and if it doesn't work out, we're still
Yep.
here. You moving away doesn't make us love you
Yep.
less. You moving away doesn't mean that planes don't go both directions." I remember having that conversation with my parents and with my sister every time when she was living in England and working in Formula One and would come home to California, and like, the weather's great here and the food's great and the people are great, and right, it's kind of special. And she would go to LAX to get on the plane to go back to England and cry. And my mom and dad would always say, the planes aren't going to stop flying after you get on
Yep.
this one, right? You can always come back if you need to and when you want to. And the fact that he had given you that advice and that permission, that you had this conversation with him now when you're really sick, and realizing how unhealthy your life is at that point. Where do you go from there? Like, and I know this isn't easy. I really want to preface this with, I know these are hard conversations. That's why it's called speed bumps, but you get through them, and there is an unbelievable shower of champagne and podium and trophies in your now life and your then future. So you get through these speed bumps, but where do you go from that moment when he says, maybe you should come home, or maybe this isn't right for you?
So a lot of people don't realize that recovering from an eating disorder isn't about learning how to eat. Like, that is literally just a symptom of the illness. When the real core of the issue is fixed, eating becomes normalized again. And when I got home, I think I started this incredibly difficult recovery period. And I think the majority of the people around me who hadn't lived through an eating disorder or with someone who has one before didn't understand. But some part of my brain knew that the only way I was ever going to get through this eating disorder was, it was literally the obsession that had replaced the Formula One obsession in my head. Like, I'd spent a decade solely focused on Formula One. And without that obsession and that passion to fuel me, my brain needs something to really focus on and excel at. But unfortunately, it was excelling at an eating disorder. And I understood that the only way I was going to get over the eating disorder was to replace the eating disorder obsession in my head with something new to focus on. But I mean, you know this, you can't just decide, I'm going to be obsessed with pottery and that'll be my thing. Like, if I try pottery and I don't like it, I can't force myself to work on it. I need to actually love the thing I'm doing. Ironically, through the eating disorder, I had discovered baking. It's a way of vicariously living through the ingredients and food without having to eat it. And it's also incredibly scientific and technical. You know, the combining of all these raw ingredients that you can't eat alone as they are, but when you bring them together and you follow the method and the process correctly, and suddenly you pull out of the oven like a perfect chocolate brownie, it's like, it's science and it's technical, but it's also like it. You live vicariously through the smell but you also see how much joy it brings other people. And I was like feeding off secondary joy from watching other people enjoy things that I was making. So I had got in my head the idea of maybe baking could be a career that I would pursue, which is hilarious because, like, 7 or 8-year-old Kate, actually I think most kids back when I was that age, no one thought that like baking cakes could be a job. Like, it's too much fun and it's something that you do with your mum in the kitchen on the weekend and you lick the bowl. But like, suddenly adult Kate was like, hang on, this could be a job. So I started pursuing it. I'm going to skip to, I was working at a cafe baking things like cakes and biscuits, but I'd really started to get like not challenged by the simple things. I mean, like I wanted to design Formula One cars. I don't go for the simple things. I need something that is really going to push me.
Right. You're not making chocolate chip cookies because that's not what you designed when you were working in Formula One, right? You weren't designing a car that was just going to do 40 miles to the gallon. You were looking for something that was going to break world speed records. You weren't just going to bake chocolate chip cookies because, like, as far as the magic of baking,
wasn't designing beforehand.
Right. Exactly. Yep.
Yep. Exactly.
So you go next level.
You get it.
What's next level?
Well, I was doing a whole lot of research on baking from around the world. And when I landed on French pastry, I'm like, oh, this is technical. Like these guys, like they've written the rule book. They've written the Formula One regulations of pastry. And I'd borrowed this book from the library about some Paris patisseries. And I got the book home and sat on the lounge room floor and randomly opened it. And like, Charlie, I can use this analogy with you because you'll get it. It was this photo of like pain au chocolat all stacked up on top of each other, and it was facing them end on. But they kind of looked like aerofoil sections with the laminar airflow going around it, and it was hypnotic. And I remember looking at it and going, oh my God, you can do that with pastry? Like they don't look like the cakes and biscuits that I'm baking. They look like something that you would, test in a flow visualization wind tunnel. I'm like, this is it. So I shut the book and I walked up to a travel agent and booked myself a ticket to Paris immediately. And when I was in Paris, I went to the boulangerie where the photo was taken. And honestly, if I thought the photo was special, like walking into this bakery and having the 3D in-person experience was a seminal moment in my life. And anyway, I left that bakery and I sent an email to the owner of it the next day because I couldn't stop thinking about it. It was like thinking about Formula One. Suddenly, French pastry was like taking up real estate in my head, pushing the eating disorder out. So I emailed him and I said, look, I can't stop thinking about your boulangerie. Is there any chance that you'd consider taking me on as an apprentice? And he wrote back and said, look, you don't speak French. We only have French-speaking people here. It's very small. It would be difficult, but for some reason I can see the same passion and motivation in you that's in me. So yes, when do you want to start? And so suddenly I had this opportunity to work in like the Formula One of pastry in a boulangerie in Paris, learning croissants and laminated pastry. And I only spent 4 weeks in that boulangerie, but I tell you what, having the opportunity to actually work in the environment and understand what a real job in pastry was before I fully committed to it, that was key, because that time in Paris was one of the happiest times in my life where I just was feeling so stimulated by what I was learning, the work I was doing, what I was creating, the team I was working with. And I'm like, yeah, this is it.
So you go from 4 weeks in a boulangerie in Paris, you go back to Australia, you eventually, and we can talk about the timeline there, but you eventually open a croissant shop to what may be the biggest rave success of a croissant opening, with lines around the block, sold out morning after morning, still sold out morning after morning.
Yeah.
And it literally launches you like a rocket to the stratosphere of the world of croissants. And it's funny, as you told that story of the boulangerie, Kate, I had goosebumps again, because as your friend, I could see the passion and the joy that those moments, that seminal moment, firstly, you seeing the Formula One car looking like a rocket ship at Melbourne Park, at Albert Park, to then walking into that boulangerie and those 4 weeks of intense training that pushed out so much of that eating disorder in your head. And all of a sudden the real estate was taken up with the joy of the magic of creating the perfect croissant and laminated pastry. Like, I just sat here listening to that with a stupid grin on my face, because it was so cool to see your passion reignited, like, as you retold that story. And you go from that to launching this, like, I mean,
It's crazy.
stratospheric beyond croissant shop. It's
Yeah.
awesome.
I actually, the time frame is really important, that 4 weeks I spent in France, because here's where the engineering world and the bakery world collide. So I spend 4 weeks in France. I come back to Australia for reasons that we don't need to go into, but I'm like now obsessed with croissants, and I really want to carry on my education in the field of viennoiserie, which croissant is part of that family. But there is no bakery in Melbourne doing anything like what I've learnt in France. And like, trust me, the Formula One level obsession did its research. And I reckon I went to every bakery in Melbourne being like, this will be the one, this will be the one. But none of them were the one. So finally, I'm like, I know how to make croissants. Maybe I'll start a business making croissants, but like, I can't have a full bakery. So what about if I just specialize in croissants and I deliver them to Melbourne's best espresso bars, because we've got like the best coffee in the world. And at 7 or 8 in the morning, I don't want chocolate brownie with my coffee for breakfast. I want a croissant, and maybe there'll be other people out there like me. So I start Lune. I find the little shop. I buy all the equipment. I use my life savings buying bakery equipment. I move out of my apartment and move into the little mezzanine above the bakery. I'm literally standing there on day one of Lune existing, thinking I'll start my recipe testing today. And I made the croissant dough, which had been my one job for the month in Paris. Like that was the one that I was like allotted every day. Kate makes the croissant dough. And then I assisted with other things, but nothing related to the croissants. And so it was a 3-day process. I made the dough. The following day, I took it out of the fridge. I just remember like putting it down on the bench and thinking, I have no idea what to do next. And like, there are 2 more, Charlie, 2 more full days worth of processes. Like, I haven't created one single layer of butter yet in my dough. I've just got a lump of dough on the bench. And I'm like, oh my God, I've literally committed my entire life to this business. I've got 3 options. I can quit the business and go back to pastry school. I can quit the business and try and find an apprenticeship and continue learning, or I can reverse engineer this, because I have something that most bakers out there don't. I've got an engineering degree, and I know how to test, and I know how to change variables, and I know how to look at data. So I spent 3.5 months. I imagined my perfect finished product, and I spent 3.5 months reverse engineering that until I landed on a technique that I was happy enough with a final product to take to market. And the Lune technique was born. And it's pretty different to a French technique. But the thing I love about the fact, and this is where it becomes very Formula One again, every single day at work, even with more than 200 staff at Lune now, every single day, every one of those staff members has the agency and the autonomy to impact the product or the process. So if a kitchen hand or like a pot wash or an apprentice or a head chef has an idea on how we can improve the quality of it, the efficiency of it, or the cost of it, we just do like you would, when I was back in the wind tunnel. We pick the one variable, we build a test around it, we do multiple tests because it's sometimes an anomaly to just do one. We prove the process, and if the process proves to be better than the original baseline, it becomes the new baseline. So it's an ever-evolving process and product, which means that I think we haven't tasted the best Lune croissant yet, which is super exciting.
That's incredible. So you literally ABA different pieces of the Lune protocol. And the fact that the Lune protocol continues to evolve is incredible. And you have multiple locations now. And you write a book, Lune croissants all day, all night. How was taking the idea, right? Like, it's so cool. The story is so cool to me, because you go from seeing a Formula One car, designing Formula One cars, spending 4 weeks as an apprentice in a boulangerie when you don't speak French. You go spend 3.5 months figuring out day 2 and 3 of making a croissant and test it, design it, engineer it. And then you open multiple shops and write a book, right? Like, I mean, it is such. It, when I was talking to my sister about chatting with you, she said, just ask her how she can be so effortlessly cool. And I think that's the question. You go from Formula One through all this process, you write a book that is world acclaimed. Like, you have gotten praise from Ottolenghi, from so many big names in the world of food globally. When I say the world, I mean global food. And you write a book, like, I think you may be the coolest person I know.
Nah.
So how do you go from figuring out a croissant to writing a book, and what is that process like? And what was the hardest part in that? What was the biggest speed bump in getting this book published?
So I think you'll appreciate this as well. The reason why people don't make croissants at home is because it's so hard and it requires commercial bakery equipment. And when I was approached to write the Lune cookbook and teach people how to make croissants at home, I was like, there's no point telling them how we do it at Lune because nobody has all the big equipment that we have there. They've got a worktop, a rolling pin, and maybe a KitchenAid and an oven. And I want to be really authentic and write a recipe that will give them the results at the end that they want. So when I approached the writing of the cookbook, I actually thought I'm going to have to completely from scratch create this process like I did the first time with Lune, but just with the home equipment and the home environment. And it just happened to be during COVID, and Melbourne had one of the strictest lockdowns in the world. And at that point in time, because I wasn't working on production as a chef, as an executive team, we decided that anyone not working on production had to work from home as well. And so suddenly I was in my home writing the Lune cookbook, and I didn't maybe if we hadn't been in a lockdown, I might have cheated and tried some things on our commercial equipment. But suddenly I was like, all I have is a bench and a rolling pin and an oven. And so for weeks and weeks, I had this idea on how to reinvent the recipe for the home baker. And I was trialing it and I was really hitting a speed bump. And I was getting super frustrated with it. It was getting me down a bit. And I called a good friend of mine who's this amazing film director. He directed The Greatest Showman. He's working on the new Robbie Williams movie. I called him. I'm like, Michael, do you ever get a bit uninspired and just not feel like getting out of bed? And he's like, yeah, of course I do. And I said, well, what do you do? Because you always seem to be like a man on the move progressing. And he's like, if I have a day like that, I don't stay in bed, which I wouldn't either. But he said, I don't stay in bed. I just change up my routine and I go and do something for myself and I take my head out of the thing that I'm really stuck on. And then I just try and create space to approach the problem from a different angle. So I did that. That day I did a bit of yoga at home and I went for a big walk. And on the walk, I had this idea. And I'm like, I wonder if that would work. And I came home and I did a bit of research into the baking science. And I'm like, oh, yeah, that could really work. It was about changing the structure of the original dough to make it more elastic to roll out by hand. And I tried it the next day and it worked first time. And I called Michael and I'm like, it worked. I'm good. And he's like, you've already done it. So it was this amazing scientific experimental process again for writing the book.
And what's next? More books in the works, global expansion of Lune. What's next for, and I'm going to say it again because I think it's one of the coolest things again, Dr. Kate Reid.
That still blows my mind. So for Lune, what's next? We've got 3 stores in Melbourne and 2 stores in Brisbane. And I'm going to say in about 2 months, although it might be a bit less than that, we're going to be simultaneously opening 2 stores in Sydney, or very close to simultaneously. Sydney's been crying loudly for years that they want a Lune. So I'm hoping that we open to a really big reception there. And then honestly, beyond Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane, we really do have global hopes for the business. And this is super exciting. Next year, we actually want to take Lune on the road and do a little pop-up road show in some key international locations. So, hey, you never know, California.
Yeah.
might be on the
Yeah, I
list.
think Camarillo, Santa Paula, Camarillo, thriving metropolises that we are. It's a short drive to LA. Everyone from LA can come up and see you here with
Yeah.
us, or we could drive down to
Yeah.
LA if LA is on your target.
Yeah.
You guarantee that Kathleen, myself, my sister Rachel, Andy, my parents, everybody will, we will hire a bus and be first in line. Because I mean, Rachel has had the croissants and she has raved about them and continues to rave about them.
Well,
Um,
did she
and
tell you
so a global presence through a roadshow. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Did she tell you that the first time we caught up when she came to Melbourne with Mercedes for the Grand Prix, I think I was in my first or second year of Lune, and she asked me to create like the Rachel croissant. I said, well, what does the Rachel croissant look like? And she's like, could you do one with avocado? So we made her an avocado and bacon croissant.
I love it. I love it. That
I love it.
sounds perfect. So Lune's gonna go to Sydney, and Kathleen and I love Australia, love Sydney. We honeymooned for a little while in Sydney. Melbourne is high on our
You have
list,
to come.
for tennis, for motorsports, for croissants, all of it. Um, and your cookbook has been so successful. Do we get another Lune? Is it Lune 2.0? What is the vision for the second Lune book, if there's one in the works, look like?
Well, it's actually not a Lune book. It's a Kate Reid book. I think one of the things that surprised
Oh, even better.
Yeah. So one of the things that surprised me with my journey, I think things that, like Dad saying never or give something a shot, having that as your frame of mind in life, you just don't know the types of opportunities that are going to come your way if you're open to them. And one of the amazing things that I do these days is a lot of people who have heard snippets of my story, they want me to come and speak at their events and conferences and inspire people that, successful career change is possible, or getting over a big speed hump, or a challenging time in your life. There can still be amazing life beyond that. And, inspiring people to start businesses, to have ideas and to go for it. So I do a lot of speaking engagements, and through that I have told my story many times, but every time I tell it, I try to do it like it's the first time I've told it to a fresh audience. And every time I do, like similar with you today, you've asked me questions I've never been asked before that make me go back and look at my life, or like parts of it, in a different way. And yeah, I think a couple of years ago, somebody wanted to write a fictionalized version of my life as a novel. And they started the process, but they ended up calling me and said, I don't think I can do this. I'm not an expert in Formula One, eating disorders, or croissants. The only person in the world that is you. You've got to write your own story. And it felt like a huge undertaking and a bit of a scary challenge. But for some reason, in the middle of last year, I just felt ready to do it. And I took myself off to Italy for a month and hid away in little villages and ate pasta for dinner and wrote during the day. And it's been one of the most incredible experiences of my life. And it's funny because, we talk about what we want to be when we're kids, when we grow up. And when I was about 8 years old, I really loved creative writing, and I'd forgotten all about that. And going back to write my autobiography or my memoir has reminded me of how beautiful the art of wordship is, and how expressive you can be. And I just finished it. I went on a second holiday to Italy back in July and wrote the last few words on the plane from Dubai back to Melbourne. And I'm now in the process with a publisher of going through the rounds of structural edit and copy edit and stuff. So hopefully hitting the shelves this time next year.
Wow. Fantastic. Well, I cannot wait. And even if we have to come to Melbourne, I think our whole family will come with copies to get you to sign them, because it will be an incredible capture of your story from so many different perspectives and lenses, overcoming challenges and encouraging through your own experience people to live their dreams. And even if they live their dream and realize it's not exactly what it's cracked up to be, figure out what's
Yeah.
next, and nothing's permanent. I do like to close the Speed Bumps podcast with the same three questions of every guest I have. We talked about the first one earlier, and I want to revisit that because it is so powerful. That you said, and I'll ask it again so you can reiterate it, but what is the best advice you've ever received, and from whom?
The best advice I've ever received was from my dad, and it was the day that I was leaving Australia to move to the UK, and I was feeling very nervous and unsure about such a big life change. And he said to me, nothing has to be forever. And those words didn't resonate with me when he said them to me, but they've come back to me so many times throughout my life. And I think it's like a gift of permission to, as you said, give things a shot. If it doesn't work out, and this is a very engineering way of thinking, if something doesn't work out the way you expected it to, it doesn't mean it's a failure. It just means it was a different result to what was expected, and there's always something to learn from that. And I think also I'm the type of person that I would prefer to try something and have it not work out the way I wanted than regret not trying it at all.
I agree. I think that's great advice, and so very poignant in so many different lenses throughout life. All right, question number 2. What's your dream car, and do you have it, or do you have a way to get it?
I feel like this is a really boring answer considering who I'm talking to, but for several years I was an ambassador with Porsche, and they gave me my dream car. I don't have it anymore, but they gave me a 911 GTS in crayon, and it was a cabriolet, and I cried the day they gave it to me, and every single second spent in that car was just magic. And the day that I had to give it back, I actually just took myself out driving for the entire day to just have my last few moments with it. It was, I think now I'll just save up so I can buy one.
I love that. And then finally, what is, in life, especially, for me as an athlete, for you working in Formula One, and then now as a world famous patisserie chef, croissanteria, I'm not exactly sure the terminology. You get this chance to meet great people all over the world and have interactions and talk to people. What is the coolest or most surprising personal interaction you've ever had with someone that you look back and you can put yourself in that moment like it was yesterday?
So,
unless of course it was yesterday and then it was yesterday.
So this is, I think it speaks to the scale that Lune's achieved, and I very rarely acknowledge that. Like, I'm in it. It's very rare that I come outside and look at what Lune is as a whole. And this particular Sunday, my friend Michael, the film director, he sent me a message. He's randomly in Melbourne, and he'll drop me a message saying, "Can we meet at Lune for a coffee in half an hour?" And sometimes I can, sometimes I can't. And this particular Sunday, I was nowhere near Lune. I was like, "Oh, Michael, I don't know. I'm not really in the neighborhood." And he went, "Oh, look, I'm just bringing a friend in. Is there any chance we could, come in at about 2:30? I'm like, "Okay, fine. I'll meet you there at 2:30, but we close at 3. And if you're not there by 3, I'm shutting the door and there won't be pastries." I was being quite firm with him. Anyway, he's like, I get to Lune at 2:30 and he's not there, and I'm getting really cheesed off. Like, "You're wasting my Sunday afternoon. Like, I don't care that you've got a friend that you want to bring to Lune, whatever." So I finally text. He's like, "I'm sorry, my friend's running late. We'll be there by 3. I'm like, "We close at 3. And he's like, "Please put a couple of pastries aside." I'm like, "Oh." So anyway, put a couple of pastries aside and we shut the door. And then I asked the team to leave the coffee machine on because Michael really likes a hot chocolate. So anyway, Michael shows up with this little guy wearing a baseball cap, and Michael gives me a hug, and then this guy gives me a hug, and he's like, "It's so great to meet you. I've heard so much about you. I can't wait. Like, my girlfriend's obsessed with your pastries." I'm like, "Yeah, whatever." Like, by this stage, I was just so annoyed that my afternoon had been wasted. Anyway, I said to Michael, "Well, you're going to have a hot chocolate. And I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. What do you want?" And he's like, "Oh, my name's Zach. Can I have a flat white, please?" I'm like, yeah, whatever. And so I go and put the drinks order in, and then I turn around and like 5 of my chefs are like the Von Trapp children, like up the wall, you know, when they're like at the dinner, like just like, and I go around to them like, what do you guys think you're doing? And they're like, why is Zac Efron at Lune? And I'm like, oh.
Wait, who? Why is he?
And I'm like, go back to work.
Oh.
Sure, he doesn't like being gawked at. And then I went over and I was like, I'm so sorry.
How incredible.
He was there for like an hour. It was great. So yeah, I've met a lot of amazing.
And to just be like, yeah.
Oh, Charlie, he was such a good dude.
So for him to just like, but walk in and just be like, oh yeah, you know, like my girlfriend loves this, and I really just like a coffee, and can I have, and I bet Michael, your buddy's like, why are you being so mean to this like global superstar? And I can just see the visual of your staff like stacked up the hallway, looking out, being like, why is he here? And you're like, who? Like, that's my buddy Michael. Oh, no, not him, the other guy.
Well, actually, Michael is almost more famous at Lune than Zac Efron. He's got his own button on the point of sale because he has a specific way he likes his croissant served. And he's the only person in the world that has his own button. So that's kind of cool.
Well, it's absolutely, he sounds like he deserves it, bringing Zac Efron into Lune. Well, Kate, it has been an absolute pleasure. I have really enjoyed this conversation. I told you I'd try and keep you for under an hour. I know you're busy. You've got a book to edit. You've got croissant shops in Sydney to open. You've got a roadshow to plan in Los Angeles soon, or wherever else in the globe you want to take it. I really appreciate you sharing some of the really hard moments that got you to this like stratospheric success with Lune, to from Formula One, through the eating disorder, through that pain, coming home and finding your feet and finding a reverse engineer, figuring out day 2 and 3 of a croissant, and to be able to do it, which with such kindness and grace, has been an absolute pleasure to hear. And if I can, I'd like to reserve the right to have you on again to talk about your book when it comes out. And one of the things we didn't talk about and touch on is being in business with family. Your brother runs Lune with you, and, you know, working with my sister over the years, I'd love to continue the conversation in the future about that.
Charlie, that would be absolutely my honor. I think we've known each other for something like 18 years now, and it's been such a privilege to watch your success and your career. And I was so honored when you invited me on. So thank you so much for having me. It's been the best hour.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kate. And we'll see you soon, either on the croissant shop, in a cookbook, or on the shelves of your local bookstore.